This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts, Global Vice President of Marketing and Extortion of the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. It's great to be with you on Gadigal land. Crickets in the background, sleeping children hopefully slumbering away. I'm ready to talk US politics and adaptation tonight.
Let's do it. And it is my great pleasure to also introduce a man who probably got you to listen to this podcast by pitching it to you in person, and will be circling back shortly to sell you a Patreon subscription, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Yes. Hello, the Willy Loman of Australian climate podcasts. Door-to-door salesman, dogged, determined, and we will see how successful. I've never seen Death of a Salesman, clearly.
All right, on this week's show, we take a look at an issues paper that has just been released to support the Albanese government's forthcoming National Climate Adaptation Plan. But first, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have clinched their respective parties' nominations for this year's US presidential election. And while this is a consequential election for many reasons, the implications for climate policy, both domestically and internationally, are pretty high up the list of very important things that will be impacted by the result. So, Tennant, are we all doomed should Biden fail to secure a second term? Or has the energy transition gained so much momentum that not even a second Trump administration can stop it?
Well, wouldn't we like to know? So there's a lot that could happen at and after this US presidential election. And the outcome is absolutely up for grabs. I don't know that anybody would feel terribly confident or secure about knowing what the outcome would be after the 2020 election was, it wasn't super close, but it wasn't the blowout that you would perhaps have thought, given how the final, well, really most of the Trump presidency went, but certainly the final year of it went. And after 2016, everybody should feel a bit cautious. So either of them could win. There is almost no chance that somebody else wins. Neither of them look like they are voluntarily giving up the quest for the presidency. And so they both have relevant commitments and people who are trying to influence them. Broadly, I think we can say if Biden prevails, then there will be 4 years of really trying to bed down the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, and to advance executive actions, particularly through the US EPA, but other agencies as well, that are in train now but not complete, like strengthening vehicle efficiency standards and regulating power plant emissions, and the methane emissions from oil and gas infrastructure. Now, other stuff could come along. There could be a bipartisan push in the Congress for permitting reform to help more big stuff get built. Maybe other stuff around trade and climate. But it's very much a continue, get the job done, complete what's been started type scenario. Now, Trump, what's he going to do if he gets in? Well, there's people with a very detailed, as these things go, comprehensive transition plan for an incoming Trump transition. It's called the Project 2025, and you can go find it online, and what a happy time you will have reading it. And the thing to recognise about that is people trying to provide an agenda for a Trump presidency. It is not guaranteed to happen even if he wins. It is people trying to grab momentum and get their own stuff and what they imagine Trump might want, or their interpretation of it, into black and white. But who knows? What is in there, though, is pretty much comprehensively refocusing the federal government away from climate change, taking the Department of Energy away from supporting the various elements of the Inflation Reduction Act, and refocusing the EPA to the kinds of things it did in the 1970s, and doing that more through delegating to the states rather than doing things itself. Uncharitably, you could say it's about crippling clean energy and environmental regulation and giving a new lease of life to US fossil fuels. Supposing that was the agenda they tried to do, there would be a bunch of constraints in the Congress and in the courts on ability to do that. How big the victory of either side was at the elections would make a huge difference to what they could get done. But broadly, the US would withdraw from a lot of activities. My best guess is that an awful lot of the wind and solar and battery deployment would still happen. The tax credits there are certainly possible to remove, but it would be a huge deal to do so. And I find it hard to imagine that Congress, even under a Republican trifecta of both houses and the presidency, would prioritise getting rid of popular and beloved by investors who are putting a lot of money down tax credits as like what they would do with their possibly one bite at the cherry of a reconciliation bill that could pass without the filibuster. So, I think it would be not great for climate if Trump won, but I don't think it would be scorched earth, except maybe literally.
I actually think the thing that's keeping me very optimistic about the idea or the prospect of a Trump victory is just how hard and potentially lower priority it might be for a re-elected Trump administration to ditch wildly popular tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. Even just recently speaking to American visitors out here, talking about lots of things, but really talking up the hurricane of carrots, that everyone's gobbling up over in the US. They are it's wildly popular, and it was bipartisan legislation to an extent when it was passed in the end. So
the infrastructure one was.
Sorry.
IRA was
they
party line.
Scraped through. But now that it's in place, it's driving a lot of activity by people that Trump, I think, would likely listen to if he was in office to a certain extent. So I don't know that all would be lost. And the other thing, just sort of listening to how things are going over there, everything's still really spooling up. Like, this legislation only passed a year and a half ago. There's been a surge of investment and lots of good things happening. But on some measures, they've only just really finished guidance material, and so some of those things are really just ramping up. So there's a lot more activity to come down the pipeline on certain things. So you would imagine then very motivated stakeholders to try and ensure those things stay. But as you say, there'd be a lot of wrecking to happen before I think a Trump administration would turn its mind to generous tax credits in the first instance.
Yeah. A few things occur to me. Like, the reality is that a second Biden administration would be focused on bedding down the stuff they've already done, not through lack of ambition or not wanting to do more, but the reality is that there's every likelihood that Biden would be facing a divided Congress, and it just makes it really hard to get any further measures through. So he's, in the world of executive orders and bedding down regulations, I think it's important to say it's obviously not great if Trump wins the election, but there are absolutely elements in, the US system which can act as a as a counterbalance. And so what we saw under the previous Trump administration is a bunch of states stepping up to the plate, California in particular, but not just California, sort of assuming what they regarded as almost a government in exile, an economy as the size of California. And there's a couple of big Democratic-leaning states around the country that, if Trump is elected, will no doubt try and assume that global role. But one thing I'm interested in hearing from you two is like, what are kind of the ripple effects from a Trump win globally? It's, I think, been welcomed that the US has been playing a proactive role in global climate negotiations and debates over the last few years. One would expect that would not be the case under a Trump administration. And the next few years are super critical, particularly as we have a whole bunch of countries considering their NDCs, the ambition they're prepared to commit to. And
well, I mean, one way of thinking about that is to look at the experience of the last time Trump was elected. And the response of the world in that instance. You saw other jurisdictions like Europe, I think, really focused on staying very ambitious around NDC. So there's a couple of things you would expect to happen, right? Trump would pull the US out of the Paris Agreement again. That would take another at least year to flow through. So it wouldn't... So there'd be this awkward situation where you'd have a lame duck Biden at the end of this year for COP.
The election would be 1 week before COP29 starts.
Yeah, but that was around the same kind of timing as the last one. Like he was just, wasn't he like just newly elected before COP happened and, you know, said, we're getting out of the Paris Agreement. And then the reality of that meant that didn't happen till the following year. So you'd have a lame duck Biden in Azerbaijan, and then presumably by the time next year's COP rolled around in Brazil, I think they'd be out. So that would happen. I think an area of policy that I'm not sure I have strong views on what he would do second time round, but would be very consequential in a climate context is how protectionist he would try to be on trade. Given
pretty
that,
protectionist.
Well, like, yes, but the experience of having done that the first time round backfired horribly in some ways.
He doesn't think so. He thinks everything was great.
It's the noted evidence-based policymaker, Donald Trump. Sure to learn from his mistakes in the past.
People were tired of winning, don't you remember?
Well, you know, a lot of US producers were really badly burnt by that. And, you know, the clear implication that he would try that again would have some implications for global supply chains on a range of fronts. Like, I think that's actually a really complex set of interactions to think about, where you've all of a sudden got a very protectionist US government, which is also, for the time being, throwing their hurricane of carrots at companies that are still able to access all these generous tax credits. And what that means for the cost of those companies doing business in that jurisdiction. Right now, interest rates are very high, and that's creating, you know, a big barrier, like it is in Australia, to getting these big projects up and running. Cost of materials, all those sorts of things are still challenges. And so the way that plays out with a protectionist trade agenda, you know, I think is very interesting and a little bit worrying to think about.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, it's not like Joe Biden has been the WTO's last best hope either, but the Trump agenda, I mean, you know, insofar as any of this stuff represents a coherent governing program rather than mouth noises to fill space in between, you know, railing at enemies and trumpeting the January 6th prisoners of conscience or whatever. The agenda is a 10% tariff on everything from everywhere, to clamp down very, very hard on legal and illegal migration, and to have massive deficit finance tax cuts, and either maybe offset that with, depending which day of the week you ask, with cuts to Social Security and Medicare, or no, just don't offset them. That sounds to some people like a recipe for like huge inflationary pressures and further interest rate hikes, and making it harder to invest in new stuff. Other people, like some non-crazy people, like Michael Petit, the economist, co-author of Trade Wars are Class Wars, he thinks the tariff would work out just fine. I don't see how, but he's not dumb. So I don't know. It would be a hell of a world, and Australia would be a pretty good place to invest in a world like that. A lot less political risk, better macroeconomic settings, no civil war.
Great place for a nuclear power plant.
Well,
fantastic.
Oh, I feel like it's very unkind for us to speculate about the potential upside for Australian climate.
Be as the vulture, Frankie.
Policy.
Think as the vulture.
Oh,
swoop.
I'm choosing to be optimistic. But one other thing that I just want to have us think about in the next little while, even if Biden is re-elected, the arc of history
bends towards justice.
Yes, in the long
These
run.
are bold claims.
I love this valiant attempt at optimism tonight amongst us. It suggests that he would, if Biden is re-elected president, he's likely to basically not have control over both houses, and possibly not even one. That sets us up for an interesting situation where, one, they've got very ambitious targets. What's been passed in IRA, whilst very ambitious, is not enough in and of itself for them to meet the, pretty ambitious emissions reductions in their NDC. So, more is needed from the US, and it's very hard to see how even a re-elected Biden will have the agency to do the things that are required from an ambition perspective. One thing I would point to in all of that, and it's, it's sort of reaffirming in one way and a little depressing in another, to know that whilst investment has been booming in the US since IRA passed on clean energy generation, they're having the same problems we are here around, they call it permitting issues, but it's basically around social license to operate, planning approvals, to build transmission, to put wind in, all these sorts of things. The same issues, are happening in the US as they are in Australia. And I wonder at the political environment, if either of them wins but doesn't have any kind of a majority or ability to influence changes in those policies, which I think will be necessary for them to sort of increase the rollout of clean energy.
Yes. One last point to get parochial for a moment. I think whatever the result, it's going to feed into the Australian election campaign that we expect in 2025. A Biden win will be seen as an endorsement for ambitious climate policy. A Trump win will be taken by some to indicate that Australia shouldn't be getting ahead of itself in leading a global conversation, that the actual global superpowers are not prepared to back in themselves.
I will just say as my last point that if anybody was worried that Joe Biden was basically King Theoden before Gandalf cures him of the grip of Saruman, just go back and watch the recent State of the Union. He's pretty sharp. He's fine. He's very old, but there's nothing wrong upstairs.
Shall we chat about a report?
We should.
Adaptation to the impacts of climate change is the often neglected sibling of climate mitigation. But despite the lower profile, it is absolutely its equal in terms of the wicked problems it serves up to policymakers. Even if our efforts to curb CO2 emissions were wildly successful, some significant climate change is already baked in, and adaptation is critical to ensure we manage the impacts on people and the natural environment. However, an effective policy response to the adaptation challenge is no small task, given the complex implications of climate change on areas as diverse as national security, health and wellbeing, the economy and food systems. And critics complain that Australian efforts on adaptation to date have been let down by piecemeal data, fragmented effort and chronic under-resourcing. The Albanese government responded to these critiques with a commitment to develop a national adaptation plan, and last week saw the release of two important documents that support its development. The first is the National Climate Risk Assessment First Pass Assessment Report, which outlines the government's initial evaluation of the climate risks that will need to be addressed by the adaptation plan. The second is the National Adaptation Plan Issues Paper, which has been released to canvass feedback from stakeholders on a range of topics related to the development of the plan. So, shout out to friend of the pod, Erwin Jackson, for suggesting, demanding we dig into all this. We have taken a look at the first pass assessment and given the issues paper a close read. Frankie, what did you make of these two documents?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's really exciting to see some serious work on adaptation kick off in Australia. It's often, adaptation is often viewed as the poor cousin to mitigation, and has certainly suffered a real lack of focus and resourcing. Although you can say that about mitigation efforts too, there really hasn't been a lot of deep thinking on the policy responses and a lot of the necessary infrastructure for us to consider climate adaptation in a serious way in Australia. So that's why the first pass risk assessment is a really important document. For the first time in a long time, it sought to look at a couple of different scenarios. So it looked at the future of a 1.5 degree temperature increase, a 2 degree temperature increase on a medium term horizon, and then on a longer term horizon, like beyond 2050 to 2090, it looked also at a 3 degree warming scenario. And then it identified a bunch of risks, 56 of them in total, across different systems, of the economy. And out of that, and it sort of did a lot of engagement with key stakeholders around the place and engaged with scientists and all of that. There's not a huge amount of detail in this paper about exactly the process they went through to refine their 11 critical risks that they're taking forward for a second pass assessment. But nonetheless, we have a set of critical risks across different systems in the economy that are going to have a further look and a response put to them. So that's a really, that's a great development. We need more and frequent review of this kind of assessment because, these things are going to change over time as the science changes, as our response to these risks does too. So we need to keep reassessing. Then we come to the adaptation plan issues paper, which was released at the same time. So these two documents have been prepared concurrently. And I think that could be part of some of the challenge in seeking to do a lot, in a short period of time, to get on with, to get on with the task of producing these policies. In theory, the adaptation plan itself, which isn't there yet, right? This is an issues paper, so we should view it in that way. should use the risk assessment as an input, and I think seek to elaborate on some of the risks identified in terms of talking about where our response and how our response needs to be framed, how we address those risks across those systems. So the issues paper starts by reiterating that we've had an agreement for a really long time in place around the roles and responsibilities of the different levels of government. And while that's true for mitigation as well, federal government has different levers available to it than state and territory and local governments. There has been an acknowledgement for a long time around the fact that when it comes to adaptation and dealing with these risks, they're best managed by those who are most able to basically implement the solution, so closest to the source.
Yep.
What that actually means in practice is that a lot of the best thinking in adaptation promotes a place-based approach where local communities, the ones who are directly impacted by these events, are the ones empowered to do something about it. Very much not the idea of a federal government from on high dictating a response on the ground. So it's sort of grounded in that local empowerment at a community level. And that agreement from 2012 in COAG, back when COAG was technically a thing, reiterates that the federal government has a role to provide data, which is a huge, huge, huge part of the story in adaptation. So one source of truth on climate risks, as well as economic support for groups that are vulnerable, amongst other things, and information as well. States and territories hold a lot of the levers when it comes to emergency response, planning systems as well. And then local governments, again, very much have an implementation role. So it outlines that. It goes into a discussion, I guess, of relevant things that are happening across 8 systems that they identify. And they also talk about cross-cutting measures as well. I'd like to get in a little bit with you both on whether or not you think the structure of this issues paper tells you much about what the National Adaptation Plan will look like. Because my initial response to this is that it details a lot of, stuff that's happening,
Yep.
but I don't get a sense of what the strategic approach to adaptation is going to be.
Yep.
That's my overarching impression of this document. And I don't mean that to be unkind, because it is an issues paper, but I don't have a sense from reading this the first time round as to what this adaptation plan is going to look like and how detailed it's going to be on the kinds of measures and by who we need to be getting on with.
Well, one thing it's not going to look like is a piggy bank.
No.
They are very keen. They are very keen to make it clear that the federal government doesn't have a Scrooge McDuck money bin that it's swimming around in, that it can shower over adaptation measures right around the country. Indeed, the exact opposite. It seems like their kind of compass bearing is to say, well, we need to set up, I guess, systems and the availability of data and the frameworks that will encourage private sector investment in adaptation, which I think that's entirely reasonable. We'll like guiding the private sector to be invested in things that are more resilient rather than less resilient is obviously a good thing. But I suppose it's something for everyone that's interested in adaptation to notice that, out of the gate, the government is saying, look, we don't have the money to pay for all this ourselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe it could have been said more frankly, although you don't necessarily expect it in documents like this. But the task on adaptation is going to be enormously expensive when you think about the cost of what needs to be done across the 8 systems which they talk about, and I'm sure we'll list them at some point. In an environment where there is already a struggle to fund mitigation measures that need doing, I think it's not just a conversation about funding adaptation measures in isolation. It's also about the competition for investment in mitigation as well. And they are very, very quick. Indeed, it's actually baked into the objective of the plan. So they publish a draft vision and objectives for the plan. And when you get to the objective point, it's about mainstreaming adaptation. So trying to bake this into BAU and, to the end of driving a very substantial growth in private sector investment in adaptation. And I think if I was going to have one criticism of this paper that I think needs to be addressed more substantially in the final plan, is that I think that's all well and good when you talk about some of the initiatives that are underway in terms of climate-related financial disclosures, which are basically pulling in the response of large corporate entities that will be, reporting on how they're managing climate risks. I think that's all well and good to set up systems to empower those people who will by and large be better resourced to make those investments themselves. Where that falls down is where you talk about everyday households and their houses across the country. And I think that cohort of people, which is most of the Australian population, are going to be exposed in one way or another to one or multiple climate hazards, and the task of making the places they live, the places they work, if they're small businesses, resilient to climate is going to be a massive, massive undertaking.
Yeah, and at this stage, which is absolutely not the finished product, the work does not really give a great sense of how large that task is or how adequate the tools contemplated are to the job. And so, one of the biggest things involved, I think, in adaptation is the fact that Australia's housing stock is shithouse as far as I think that's the technical terminology. As far as thermal comfort and safety is concerned, it's bad today. New houses will be a lot better thanks to the standards that are in place, but new houses only mount up so fast. Old houses only get demolished and replaced so fast. We've got a massive lift if these houses are going to be safe for people to live in, if the temperature is like a global average temperature rise of 3 degrees, which is absolutely possible. Everybody is working feverishly, almost everybody, maybe not the Trump campaign, to avoid that outcome. But it's totally possible. And that would be one where the temperatures on land in heat waves in Australia would be like 5 or 6 degrees higher than the pre-industrial level. Those are bad heat waves. You want some good houses for people to be safe. That's a big task. And how do we? Where are we at on the rate of turnover of houses and the rate of building new houses and all of that versus this challenge? That's something that this paper does. Neither of these papers attempts to grapple with. that do things add up. They do name check an awful lot of initiatives in every area. Some of them give you a greater, like I felt like the run through of what's going on in agriculture and in health was pretty good as far as giving a sense of a coordinated strategic effort underway with a bunch of initiatives that they're not completely comprehensive, but they seem to be sort of covering a lot of gaps. Others, it was just a laundry list of, we're doing this, we're doing that. There's and what does it all add up to? Who knows? It was very inputsy, not outcomesy. And outcomes is where we need to get to.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think that reflects the relative effort that has been put in over previous years in those different areas, right? And when you're looking, you'd be bouncing across all of these different areas.
I'll list them: defence, the economy, First Nations, health, infrastructure, nature, primary industries, regions, and cross-system. Everyone's favourite.
So inevitably there's some of those areas where there has been deep thought in some cases over a number of years about the implications of climate for those sectors. In others, it's kind of like that hasn't really been at the top of the agenda and needs to rocket up that agenda pretty quickly. Going to the point that I think we're putting our finger on, which is kind of the relative capability of different actors to respond to these risks. There's a really telling couple of sentences in here. And early in the paper, it says that governments have a leadership and coordinating role in adaptation. However, it is generally most efficient and appropriate for businesses and individuals to understand and manage their own risks where they can do so. So that kind of gets at a little bit the fact that that you were pointing to, Frankie, that best practice in this space is to empower local communities to kind of shape their own approach to adaptation. But those last few words in that sentence, where they can do so, is doing a lot of heavy lifting, right? And particularly when it comes to most individuals, they don't have the capability or the capacity to respond. And so government necessarily has its role. And I feel like in some of the framing, they're so keen to make it clear that government can't pay for it all, that they neglect some of the other levers that government has in terms of regulation, in terms of, smart government programs that activate activity that can support individuals to adapt. And I'm really hopeful that, as this work is iterated, some of those ideas will become a lot more prominent because they're going to be essential to any effective adaptation response, right?
I wonder if I might use an example to talk through, like to put a bit of colour.
I think that would be great because there was no colour or example in either of these papers.
Okay.
They're super abstract.
Okay. I'm gonna talk about housing because it's something that I live and breathe every day from a policy context, and I want to point out that the potential for how bad this stuff can get when it comes to the response to, a crisis of a natural hazard that hasn't been planned for appropriately or if even couldn't have been predicted, prior to the climate warming to the extent it already has, is visible today. We've experienced unprecedented bushfires in the summer of 2019 to 2020. We've seen flooding happen repeatedly, most acutely in Queensland and northern New South Wales. But if you want to see what the potential looks like when governments end up being effectively on the hook to finance the recovery of that, you just need to look at Lismore, where there are houses impacted by that flooding that have been deemed no longer livable, and the state government has offered buybacks to people living in Lismore. So if you want to and think about what that potentially looks like writ large, and why the national government might be so keen to say, hang on a sec, we, this can't be done solely through public funding, is because one of the more extreme examples of what that potentially looks like as a response after really significant events like flooding or fires is that the government will pay to buy your house, which has no value really anymore, because no one can or should want to live there because the risks are so great of events like this happening repeatedly, and the cost of rebuilding each time isn't worth it because, perhaps that house shouldn't be there at all anymore. So that's what that looks like at one extreme, where, not a lot of effort historically has obviously gone into mitigation. We are where we are. We're in 2024, and I don't know. Nobody foresaw that kind of flooding happening in Lismore way back when those houses were designed, for example. But that's an enormous amount of money to think about a government expending every time a crisis happens, and unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of that happen over the next couple of decades. To try and turn that on its head and think about what governments can do is a lot. Like, there is a lot that can be done. If you think about the levers that the federal government has, well, they're responsible for setting the standards that housing is built to through the National Construction Code. They can look at providing projections of future climate under different scenarios such that new houses can be tested against those projections. It might interest listeners to know that when you model the requirements of heating and cooling a house today, so you're modeling the load that you need to manage to keep a house comfortable. That modeling exercise is done based on historical data. So we're modeling houses for the future based on basically reference years of past climate that are intended to be representative. But we know now that nothing about previous climate is representative of the kinds of conditions that most houses will face in 20, 30 years from now. So they can look at adding projections or, things that would mean that we're designing houses to be a lot more comfortable in higher temperatures today. That will still be around when those temperatures, have increased to an amount. State governments can look at overhauling their planning systems, which involves where houses are constructed. It also can overlay things like requirements to build to higher standards. Where you're in a bushfire zone, for example, you need to build to a different standard and things like that. And, there's a lot of things that can be done to support consumers to make better decisions. One of the concepts that's touched on here goes to this idea about effectively a form of disclosure. So we talk about this a lot in terms of energy performance, It's the old example we like to trot out that you can buy a washing machine that has a star rating on it, tells you how energy efficient it is, etc. There's no information like that available when you're renting or buying a house. And in the same way, there could be some form of, I would hope, consumer-friendly information given to people that will tell you what the kind of risks are involved to that house if you were looking to buy it or rent it based on where you are and the climate that prevails. So there is an enormous amount that can be done by governments and by the private sector. So it's not all doom and gloom, but I would have really liked to see some of this, articulated in the paper.
And the quality of information provision is really important because like any given landlord or seller of a house almost certainly is not in a great position to know the future climate state of that region. there is a lot of work from the feds and more coming, and from researchers sponsored by the feds, to provide a new generation of regional climate models and downscaling of that data so that there is easier to hand information for everybody who needs to draw on. One of the things that it probably is ridiculous that I was surprised by this, but I was surprised in the course of going through these papers is how large the climate-related financial disclosures loom as a plank of the adaptation strategy. I think I had been focusing on those that policy more in terms of companies' participation in mitigation and their plans to respond to other mitigation efforts and find opportunities and get ready if their market for high-emitting stuff is going to shrink, etc. But the part where they have to look at what their physical risks are and risks in their supply chain, if that is not a box-ticking exercise but a consciousness-raising exercise, that is very powerful. It's only going to apply to big-ish businesses on the current scope, not just whoppers, but big-ish eventually. But that the process of examining those risks, I think, there's not a lot of people who are aware of the risks that they face in future as yet. And I've been in a depressing number of climate adaptation discussions where the business reps faced questions about adaptation and mostly gave answers about mitigation because that's the argument that they're used to being a part of.
Yeah.
Well, maybe they need to participate in some workshops contemplating some narrative-based climate scenarios, Tim.
Ooh, deep cut.
I think that there's something which is sometimes underappreciated, that the kind of education process we're talking about in terms of adaptation is actually incredibly helpful for motivating action on mitigation. Because if you start to understand the granularity around, what a 1.5 versus 2 to 2.5 to 3 degree scenario means, not just in the abstract for people at some point in the future, but for you and your family and your business, then that becomes an incredible motivator for taking those mitigation actions. The other interesting thing that they call out here, which is just that you can see them starting to kind of provide a bit of a framework for prioritisation, because there's so much in this space. It is inevitable that we're going to have to make choices. And one of the things that they list as a key consideration for effort on adaptation is actions that will, kill two birds with one stone, or even three, right? So the ones that they call out as adaptation actions that will also reduce emissions and also reduce inequality or support vulnerable communities. And so these aren't two separate conversations. No. They're the same conversations, and the more that we can think about them in an integrated way, the better we'll be going on both sides.
Yeah. And another thing that leapt out to me in this process is just how unattainable the strictest idea of a least cost response to climate change is.
Yeah.
Because one of the things there is you work out the efficient level of climate change it's worth avoiding, and you mitigate towards that, and then you only adapt towards what's left.
Yeah.
And you minimise your expense. And if we can't do anything like that, we are going to have to build towards a higher level of climate change than we hope to experience, because it would be crazily irresponsible to build towards less than 3 degrees, because we might well wind up with it. And we've got to mitigate towards as close to 1.5 as we can get. And we are going to be very distant from the perfect foresight, perfect rationality, least cost ideal.
I completely agree with that instinct. I don't want to undersell just how difficult a task that would be.
3 degrees ain't good.
I have spoken to corporates that include a 4-degree scenario in their own, yes, climate-related financial disclosure reporting is coming down the line, but a lot of large corporates have been looking at these risks for some time voluntarily and proactively and looked at scenario analysis. And 4 degrees is like civilization, the economy doesn't exist anymore kind of stuff, like a hellish landscape to contemplate.
Maybe we need some like movie analogies. Like that's 4 degrees is Mad Max. 3 degrees, I don't know, Children of Men. I'm not sure what 2 degrees would be. Help me out here.
Her.
There you go.
But you could argue the toss in whether we're living with something close to 1.5 degrees in Australia now, because we experience more than the global average and all of that. But there is an enormous difference between 2 degrees and 3 degrees of warming. And when you think about like the cost that will be involved to businesses, to the government, to people, to adapt their assets to a stated level of warming based on what we are not sure will happen, that might happen. Like that's actually just devilishly hard.
That's
and we don't have a very good track record of doing that at all in this country, to say let's like over-design everything to this point because we might need it and it's going to cost you a mozza more than it would.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is just so hard. I don't think there are any easy answers here. And there are, I liked what you called up, Luke, there about talking about how they've prioritized and sort of talked about sequencing actions. Like that's absolutely where you need to start. You need to do things that are no regrets actions that will prompt enabling sort of work of others and all these sorts of things. Because if you focus too much on what's possible down the track, it all becomes very overwhelming very quickly.
We just wouldn't want to wind up with an adaptation plan that is basically think positive, people.
No. So I do think the plan that eventuates here does need to be grounded in some very practical actions and commitments. And maybe the other question I had for the both of you as well is how you think that might work when I think they're also saying that what this plan is not going to do is, duplicate work, like more detailed work that other state governments have done. It also seems to suggest it's not going to come over the top of the sector decarbonisation plans, which, I think we've talked about mostly in the context of mitigation efforts, but are also meant to be looking at adaptation as well. So it'll be interesting to see how this strikes a balance at having like practical actions, but doesn't go to the level of superseding or taking over things that might be done in discrete economic sectors as well.
Yeah, I think the plan is going to be highly imperfect and it's going to need to keep iterating.
Yep.
And this second pass assessment of the risks that is underway, focusing on the top 11 most worth focusing on risks, chosen for reasons that, like, they name the kinds of reasons that might have been involved, but they don't give us a great sense of what the individual calculations were for the other 45 risks.
Yep.
And like some of the kinds of, like they might have deprioritized others because they didn't seem that severe in the end, but they might have deprioritized them because it didn't seem obvious what could be done about them, even if they were really severe, or that they were just really hard to analyse. And then they seem to have covered some just so they had at least one for every system of significance that they were focused on. So we're going to get this further layer that will have quantitative analysis as well as deeper qualitative analysis of these risks. And I don't think we've mentioned, we've been criticising them a little bit for abstractness. The risks that they're focused on are for defence, domestic disaster response and recovery, and the risk of government capacity being overwhelmed. In health, risks to health from slow onset and from extreme impacts. Infrastructure, risks impacting access to essential services. Nature, loss of species leading to failures of ecosystem and landscape function. Sounds bad. Primary industries, lost productivity and quality and profitability. Regions, risks where those regions are supported by natural environments, which, I mean, name me a region that's not supported by its natural environment, but still. And then cross-system stuff around legacy and future planning problems that are increasing the vulnerability of communities, risks to supply chains and disrupting goods and services, risks to the real economy from financial system shocks and other acute impacts, risks from governance structures not being fit for purpose, and finally, but not least, risks to water security. And those are all, they're worth attention. They're things that matter. The other 45 have got some bangers too, though.
It would have been nice to see a little more detail in the assessment about the rationale for picking out those 11, because there are some real doozies in the remaining 45. And, I think, of course, you do need to prioritise and focus where you can initially, but then there's a risk that, your world gets a little bit smaller when you choose to focus on those 11, and there are a lot of important things to consider across all of those systems that, that don't appear on that shortlist. And maybe the feedback is all of this needs to be re-examined on a regular basis. I think the rationale in the National Adaptation Plan seeking feedback on is, around governance of these things.
Yes.
What's the process for reviewing and updating this over time and evaluating progress? And in some sense...
What's the magic number?
Unsurprising that the cadence seems to match the conversation around mitigation, in that, broadly speaking, that sort of 5-year horizon seems sweet, with reviews at the midpoint, and then final, and then sort of recommendations to legislate, for that process of review as well. But in looking at, the role of things like this climate risk assessment and the potential action that it drives off the back of it, it feels like the sort of thing that should be re-examined from time to time. So we're not narrowing our focus and not sort of zooming back out.
I agree. And I think that iterative process will be really important. But just as important is the question of who does it.
Yeah.
Right. So at the moment, this is an exercise being driven by the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. That's fine. But the whole premise of our conversation today is that this is an agenda that is just as significant as the mitigation agenda.
Yeah.
We have a whole climate change authority that's set up just to focus on mitigation. Its remit doesn't include adaptation. And my question would be, why not? The importance of the independent risk assessment that is provided to the Australian public, to policymakers, to governments, who then have an opportunity to respond. I think that principle holds just as strongly for adaptation as it does for mitigation. and whether it's the climate change authorities that currently exist, whether it's a new body, but having that independent analysis and advice to government on these matters would be incredibly helpful, because it's such a complex space. And there's a lot of really tough political issues that need to be grappled with in every single one of these systems that the risk assessment is trying to engage with.
Oh, yeah.
I can almost psychically sense people at the Climate Change Authority willing you to shut up right now, Luke. Don't they have enough problems to deal with?
Yeah. Hi, Brad.
Isn't their life hard enough?
Well, they don't want to come up with a national plan around managed retreat.
Of the Climate Change Authority, backing away slowly.
That's right. I think that's right, Luke. But I would also call out that there are a very strong and specific roles for other institutions that already exist in Australia, like the CSIRO and the BOM as well. All because of the nature of requirements here for data and that sort of single source of truth, and a need for, I could only stress how important it is that there is some broader buy-in around the scenarios that we choose to focus on from a policy response context, that we would want consistency on that where possible across the country. And actually, agencies like CSIRO and BOM are also really critical in producing that evidence base.
Yeah, 100%. All right, it is now time for one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I have an extremely niche book to recommend, that I am enjoying reading at the moment. It is a 1995 work of science fact and execrable science fiction by a physicist and aeronautical engineer and sci-fi fan named Robert L. Forward. And the book is called Indistinguishable from Magic. It is about prospects for hyper-advanced technologies that would be, per the Arthur C. Clarke saying, sufficiently advanced technologies to be indistinguishable from magic. And its relevance to this podcast is the very cavalier attitude to energy efficiency in it. It opens with a chapter on the fuel of the future, not hydrogen. Goodness no, antimatter. Antimatter, which could be used not just for like rockets to the stars, but in Robert L. Forward's vision, for airplanes, for welding machines, for any number of devices being used all over the place. And we can just trip lightly past the hard gamma radiation released by every proton-antiproton mutual annihilation. He holds out the tantalizing prospect that the electrical energy efficiency of antimatter production could be raised all the way to 0.01%. So if you think that some of the clean energy intensive industries we're talking about today are electricity intensive, antimatter laughs in your face and then explodes you in a shower of gamma rays. It's a fun book, but he's a masterful info dumper and a dreadful writer of prose.
Perhaps not bedtime reading for any of the public servants beavering away on the National Energy Performance Strategy.
They might have some ideas as to where a few well-placed antiprotons could go.
All right, Frankie, what have you got?
I am going to give a plug for a podcast we have mentioned like quite a few times here called Volts. It's an American podcast, and they did an episode not too long ago on how IRA is doing, so relevant to our chat in the opening segment, and interviewed Trevor Hauser from the Rhodium Group, who, is a data guy and has been looking at like just how the investment has gone in various technologies and, you know, uptake of things that were subject to the hurricane of carrots, you know, that IRA put in place a year and a half ago.
Using that phrase, like I'm just imagining people with carrots being stabbed into their eyes.
I need to.
You went dark there, Luke.
That's really dark. Wow.
It's just like there's a hurricane and there's just carrots flying everywhere.
But that's exactly what's going on. There's lots of carrots and it's more...
I did once see a gory Japanese movie that was like that, but with fried shrimp.
They're both wildly distracting. But the salient point is, Luke, there's lots of carrots and it's more fun to say hurricane of carrots than lots of carrots. That's all there was to it.
I'll allow it.
All right. So I'm just going to do a very quick TLDR for some of like the shout outs that were in there. Like, it is working. I think to the extent they can determine this through the data they've got access to, because tax receipts aren't, you know, as accessible and things like that. There was an uplift in overall investment into clean tech and transport to $239 billion in 2023, up from 139 billion in 2021. So that's a stonkingly big number.
Yeah. That's a lot of billions.
Yeah, and only I think 34 or so of that was federal government spending. So, like, you know, one government dollar driving, you know, $5 to $6 in private investment, which is like, or at least that much, which is the kind of ratio you definitely want to see in these kinds of programs. And I think I already talked about some of the challenges they're having, which is that, you know, electricity generation's going really well, but they're facing the same challenges we are here in transmission and, you know, planning approvals and things like that. The one that I was a little sad to hear is that uptake of heat pumps is not happening as fast or as much at all compared to some of the other things. And they seem to tie this to, and sort of overall building electrification is tied up in that as well. And there, I think, sort of reasoning around this is more around the interest rate sort of situation, really putting off investment in construction activity effectively. So where you're going to get the kind of renovations happening on the residential front. You know, it's just not an environment that's conducive to people doing a lot of building, either in a residential context, I'm assuming commercial as well. So let's hope that picks up. But it's a great pod. They step through some really interesting data, things that are surprising, progress across the board. It was great.
If you want to know what's on the chopping block this November.
Well, I thought we were trying to be a little more optimistic about things.
What's on the launch pad this November?
All right. Well, for my one more thing, I just thought I'd note that the debate around climate disclosure in Australia continues to bubble along. Referenced as it was in our chat about adaptation. It's a fairly significant effort driven by Treasury. New requirements to disclose climate-related risks in annual reports were supposed to commence in the middle of the year, but some business groups are nervous, have been calling for a delay, and some have even been expressing a concern around the level of liability these disclosures will place on directors. Now, despite all that argy-bargy, I don't think there's any indication that Australia is about to follow the US, where the Security and Exchange Commission just a couple of weeks ago released its final disclosure requirements, which were significantly watered down from the draft requirements, including the removal of any requirement that Scope 3 emissions are disclosed. I don't think our government's going to do that, but we don't have the final legislation yet. The exposure draft was released by Treasury in January, so we should have some final legislation to look at any minute now. Definitely one to keep an eye out in terms of where exactly our government lands on that important reform.
Indeed.
All right, that is our show for today. If you have comments on anything that we've been chatting about, or indeed reports that you would like us to peruse for your listening pleasure, you can send them to mailbag@letmesumup. Frankie, we also have a website. What is it?
It is letmesumup.net, and you can go there to listen to every single episode that we've ever recorded of Let Me Sum Up. And the only things that aren't on there, actually, are the BOCO episodes that we're recording from the Patreon, which is a nice little segue to why you should support us on Patreon.
Why, patreon.com/letmesumup is the place to go if you want to show your true understanding and appreciation of this podcast and all the other wonderful listeners who are taking the next step to become super Summerupperers by backing the pod for the low price of $10 a month in return for a positively antimatter annihilation level glow of satisfaction and exclusive access to information not revealed to the common run of ordinary mortals, like the titles these episodes nearly had or the full deep notes. And like sometimes you might wonder, well, how much more could be in these full deep notes than what they talk to?
Oh, so much more.
Think back to the start of this episode in the US politics discussion. Dear listener, there's 3 pages of detailed, insightful notes that if you were a US political operative, you would be paying consultants for those notes, I swear, and a lot more than $10 a month.
There is a tabulated scenario analysis in there that is worth the $10 per month alone.
Yep. And if you need more convincing, even after that compelling pitch, I want to give a shout out to the public endorsement that Super Summerupper Monique Alfres gave us recently on social media. Monique says, I highly recommend Frankie's Let Me Sum Up pod. As a new mum, a pod that can keep you up to date whilst on parental leave, make you laugh, and true story, put your baby to sleep is well worth a listen.
That was definitely intended as a compliment, and I feel compelled to explain. And I'm so glad you called out Mon, because I was going to. But you know, she turned up to one of our fabulous industry conferences last week, run by the Green Building Council, Transform, with her gorgeous, I think, 4 or 5 month old baby Eve, and she was saying how awesome it had been to see my little bub getting around at COP in Dubai with the 3 of us, and that it's great to see, you know, us involving our kids in the work that we're all passionate about. And so shout out to Super Mum and Super Summerupper Mon Alfres.
All right. I was thinking, while Tennant was reading out those various climate risks in that baritone, like babies around the country could be being put to sleep as we speak.
And the third climate risk was just right.
All right. I think that's a show for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid. I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.